afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to see you all here for our 2023-24 Faculty Fellows presentations. So as you may know, the IHC Faculty Fellowships give faculty time away from teaching to concentrate on their research and creative projects. And for this reason, it is one of the most valuable grants the IHC administers, and it is highly coveted. And I must say that I love the process of reading and discussing the outstanding applications we get every year for this award. It's like having a view into the most innovative R&D labs at the Humanities, Arts, and Humanistic Social Sciences on our campus. And I must also say that learning about the work of our colleagues is very inspiring for me. I am proud that the IHC can support this work as it develops, and I'm excited to be able to introduce this year's Faculty Fellows to you. And I'll do one at a time. So thank you all for coming to the gathering, which I know you're going to enjoy. Each of our fellows is going to speak about their work for 20 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to the audience for questions. Before we begin, allow me to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located. And I would also like to pay respect to elders, past and present, as well as other Indigenous people present today. Our second speaker is Mona Damluji, an assistant professor of film and media studies. Her teaching and research and creative work engage the underrepresented media histories and cultural studies of energy, cities, and infrastructure centered in the Middle East and its diasporas. Her publications have appeared in journals such as Media Plus Environment, International Journal of Contemporary Iraqi Studies, and Media Fields Journal. Mona is also a documentarian and curator, having produced 2 seasons of the documentary series The Secret Life of Muslims, and co-curated a traveling exhibition on Arab comics. Today she'll be discussing her current book project, Pipeline Cinema. Welcome.
Well, I want to begin by thanking Susan and Chris and Paula and the staff here at IHC for always putting on these impeccable events, and of course, for welcoming me into this fellowship. It's been hugely beneficial. So the work I'm sharing today comes from my book project, Pipeline Cinema. And the aim of my talk is to illuminate the key themes from my study of the origins of the oil industry film use in the Middle East, centered in Iran and Iraq during the mid-20th century. Since the late 19th century, extractive capitalism has converted layers of fossilized life compressed deep below Earth's surface into petroleum for global consumption. In regions of the global south marked for petroleum extraction, foreign oil companies and governments build networks of infrastructure and labor required for resource conversion. This conversion requires cultural mediation to establish and protect oil companies' social license to operate. Here, cultural mediation refers to how stories about oil are generated and distributed. This is a critical aspect of oil company operations until today, which, like its physical operations, need dedicated space, equipment, people, and expertise. Pipeline Cinema reveals these storytelling operations as cultural infrastructure of oil extraction. So in other words, this book insists on us seeing the apparatus of oil extraction as an essential site of cultural production. It concentrates the study of oil culture around the oil fields of Khuzestan in Iran and Kirkuk in Iraq, regions whose oil culture has not been studied despite their centrality in global histories of oil. And just to give you a sense of the centrality, during the 1950s, the world's largest oil refinery was in Khuzestan, in Abadan, and the world's largest oil pipeline originated in Kirkuk. These sites reveal that geographically distant cultures of oil consumption are inextricable from colonial extraction at the origins of petro-industry. Centering people and experiences reveals another lens on an otherwise dehumanizing industry and an oil discourse that is typically confined to terms of infrastructure, security, and profit. So for the remainder of my talk, I will attempt to do just that, centering the experiences of individuals who lived at the intersection of the oil and film industry in Iraq. The Palestinian poet, novelist, visual artist, and cultural critic Jabra Ibrahim Jabra began his career with the Iraq Petroleum Company, or what I'll refer to as the IPC, quite unexpectedly. It was 1952, and Jabra was at home in Baghdad, enjoying a leisurely afternoon in the company of his beloved Lamia, when he was startled by the abrupt arrival of an old acquaintance. Michael Clark, a documentary filmmaker from London, barged into Jabra's room unannounced to coax him into accepting a job in translation. And no, Jabra was not riding a donkey when he barged into the room, but this just happens to be the only photograph that is available of Michael Clark. Specifically, Clark asked Jabra to translate the film script for the Iraq Petroleum Company's first sponsored film, which Clark had written, from English into Arabic. It had been 7 years since the two men had seen each other in Jerusalem during the waning years of the British occupation of Palestine, which persisted from 1917 to 1948. Clark, then an English soldier, and Jabra, an emerging Palestinian writer, were both Cambridge educated and in their 20s. They were introduced through a common acquaintance and discovered shared interests in conversing on topics of literature and politics. After Clark's military deployment in Palestine ended, the two lost touch, and neither had known what had become of the other. In 1948, Jabra's family was forced to leave their home in West Jerusalem. That year, in what Palestinians mark as the inception of the ongoing Nakba, or catastrophe, Zionist forces declared the establishment of the State of Israel, expelling at least 750,000 Palestinians from their homes and villages, including Jabra's family. In exile, he eventually found a position as a college professor at the University of Baghdad in Iraq, where he remained for most of his life. In Iraq, he found himself immersed in a thriving cultural milieu of modernist writers, artists, poets, architects, and musicians. And just to kind of give you some names to the faces I've included here, Jawad Salim is one of the best-known modernist artists of mid-century Iraq. Nazik al-Malaka, known as the first free verse poet to write in Arabic, and Rifat Chatterjee, Ma'ath al-Lusi, modernist, some of the biggest players in terms of modernist architecture coming from Iraq. And below is Jabra with Jawad Salim. So there was really a community at the time between all these different disciplines. And of course, at the top is the Freedom Monument in Tahrir Square in Baghdad. That was a collaboration between Chatterjee and Jawad Salim. So from Iraq, Jabra penned his most internationally renowned literary contributions, including several novels, short stories, poetry collections, and cultural criticism, and Arabic translations of works by Shakespeare, William Faulkner, Samuel Beckett, and Oscar Wilde. Meanwhile, on his donkey, after Clark completed military service at the end of World War II, he returned to England. And there he fell in with a group of filmmakers He fell in with a group of filmmakers associated with John Grierson, who's pictured up on the left, and the British documentary film movement. By 1945, at the end of the war, the London-based group had pivoted from making government propaganda films toward the production of industrially sponsored films. Clark gravitated towards a specialization in industrial films documenting infrastructure projects, writing and directing films sponsored by the National Coal Board, and then later joining British Transport Films. The Iraq Petroleum Company, a multinational oil corporation headquartered in London, which held exclusive rights to Iraq's oil reserves between 1925 and 1960, sponsored its first film in 1951. The mastermind behind IPC's film use was Arthur Elton, a film producer and major figure in the British documentary film movement who worked closely with Shell and British Petroleum, or BP, who were both stakeholders in the Iraq Petroleum Company. Michael Clark's experience in Palestine apparently gave him an edge over his contemporaries, since he had some familiarity with Arabic, and Elton hired Clark to direct the IPC's first documentary. Clark arrived in Baghdad in February 1952. With a crew of 2 British and 1 Iraqi cameraman, they began shooting the documentary about the construction of IPC's new 30-inch pipeline, the world's largest at the time. connecting the oil fields of Kirkuk in Iraq to the Mediterranean port and Banias, Syria. So on this map, it is the uppermost line that's in black, connecting the oil fields in Kirkuk all the way out to Banias. And you'll notice that the lowest line here to Haifa is indicated as not in use. The pipeline film had become a centerpiece of the IPC's first public relations campaign, which hoped to popularize a new oil narrative, reframing the foreign oil company and its infrastructure as nationally beneficial assets essential to the prosperity of modern Iraq. The oil company turned to cinema to perform an alchemy of steel into water, transforming the extractive machinery of the oil pipeline into Iraq's third river. And this was the title given to the IPC's first film, The Third River. The titular metaphor reimagined the pipeline as a river of oil that promised to build modern Iraq, just as the twin rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, had made possible great civilizations that came before. Rivers, of course, are the life-giving arteries that preceded and eventually sustained human settlement in Mesopotamia, or the land between two rivers. The Greek name for the Mesopotamia is the Greek name for the area contained by Iraq's modern state borders, and refers to the twin Tigris and Euphrates that define its geographical and ecological contours along the north-south axis of water flow from the watershed of the Taurus Mountains to the river mouth at the Persian Gulf. The British-controlled oil company's naming of the pipeline as the Third River aimed to reorient the cartography of modern Iraq, according to an east-west axis defined by the infrastructure of oil extraction, from reservoirs of crude oil in Kirkuk to the terminal ports on the Mediterranean Sea. The IPC pipeline documentary quickly became the centerpiece of the company and the Iraqi government's storytelling campaign about oil in Iraq. In 1946 and 1948, Iraqis had mobilized in unprecedented numbers to protest the continued and outsized British dominance over Iraq's economic and political affairs, epitomized by the foreign oil company headquartered in London, which had maintained, again, exclusive rights to Iraq's oil. Amidst the general atmosphere of animosity toward the IPC, the company, according to its own promotion of the film in the journal Film User, aspired to present its Third River pipeline story to Iraqi audiences in order to, quote, reconcile the oil company to the population and to prevent Persian happenings from repeating themselves, referring, of course, to the uprisings in Iran that led to oil nationalization and the ousting of the British oil company from Abadan in 1951. For Clarke, this meant that his artfully scripted commentary required translation into Arabic. He inquired with a colleague about finding a talented local writer with a, quote, modern outlook, and he was referred to Jabra. Jabra accepted the job offer, and the two worked closely on the final commentary for the Third River. This opportunity initiated Jabra's long-term involvement with the IPC's public relations efforts in Iraq in the decades that followed. In Jabra's words, his contributions to the company's cinematic productions were, quote, another means of expression besides writing and painting, and sometimes no less exciting to my imagination and pleasure. Jabra also served as the editor for the oil company's Arabic magazine Ahl Neft, or People of Oil, until the Iraq's Ba'ath Party declared the total nationalization of the oil company's assets in 1972. In his memoir, Jabra describes his role at the company as, quote, an enjoyable job at a good salary that gave Lamia the opportunity to leave her teaching later. He notes, I worked in a civilized atmosphere that helped me continue my intellectual activities as I wished for about a quarter of a century. The entanglements between Arab writers, filmmakers, and artists, the British film industry, and the foreign oil company in Iraq in the mid-20th century are at the center of my book project, Pipeline Cinema. These encounters, such as that between Jabra and Clarke, were situated in the long shadow of colonialism in the Middle East, where colonial mandates in Iraq and Palestine guaranteed British control over the exploitation of land, labor, and resources, including petroleum. Even as they developed a camaraderie in Jerusalem and a working relationship in Baghdad, the differences of colonizer and colonized shaped the terms of Jabra and Clark's relationship. Jabra was not the sole cultural mediator in the oil company. Drawing from the influential modernist cultural movements that shaped the literary and cultural renaissance in Baghdad during the 1950s, the oil company developed a public relations strategy using film and publications that depended upon Arab creative labor. Iraqi and other Arab writers, directors, cinematographers, editors, musicians, artists, poets, and photographers were essential to the IPC's film productions and print publications throughout the 50s. After the release of The Third River, the IPC established a local film unit based in Iraq, demonstrating its primary concern controlling the company's image and the oil story among Iraqis. The IPC promoted the narrative of a strong oil state in films, magazines, and reports intended to impress on Iraqis the universal benefits of IPC control. Using images of infrastructure and social services financed by petrodollars, the company aimed to contain popular support for oil nationalization. The approach was short-sighted and underestimated public discontent with extraction and colonialism. And yet, the oil company's creative endeavors are more than simply propaganda. These projects produce unexpected relationships and possibilities for expression and exchange. Cinematic production was a critical site in which the ambiguous relationship between the foreign oil company and its cultural mediators took shape. On the one hand, the oil company was working systematically to siphon local talent in the service of its extractive agenda. On the other hand, the Iraqis and Arabs working as cultural mediators for the IPC used the financial sponsorship, training opportunities, and institutional support as social and material capital. The pipeline, in short, operated as infrastructure for resource and cultural extraction, as well as generative social spaces in which complicated men from diverse backgrounds and political orientations forged tense, intimate, and powerful relations. Pipeline cinema foregrounds these otherwise unexamined cultural contours of oil infrastructure. Wells, pumping stations, and refineries that doubled as sites of cinematic encounter, where films would be produced and exhibited in an attempt to establish and protect major oil companies' social license to operate in the Middle East. So I'm going to close my talk about my research there, but I would like to conclude by thanking again the IHC for the fellowship, which has been so vital in supporting my ability to continue work on this book project, and also by recognizing the extraordinary conditions of knowledge production and pedagogy that we all sit in today. I know I'm not alone when I share that I have been doing this work while in a state of continuous grief since last October. We are grieving the deaths of 1,139 Israelis killed in Hamas's attacks on October 7th, and more than 35,000 Palestinians killed in Israel's relentless bombardment of Gaza over the past 220 days. A death toll that does not take into account the modest estimate of 10,000 men, women, and children who are buried under the rubble and presumed dead, and at least 498 Palestinians killed in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. My ability to write and think about histories of cultural production in Iraq and Iran, marked and marred by colonial extraction, while sitting at a distance but still under the dark shadow of this genocide, reveals the tremendous privileges of my position within this university. Over the past 220 days, our campus has been home to a powerful movement united in its shared commitment to and love for liberation of Palestine and people everywhere. Since October, a coalition of 19 different Arab, Jewish, BIPOC, and queer-led student organizations have united around the call for ceasefire now, with undergraduates, graduate students, staff, postdocs, lecturers, and Senate faculty from across the 3 divisions coming together week after week in grief, in love, and in community. And yet, just 2 weeks ago, within the same university system, we witnessed as vigilantes brutalized peaceful student protesters on UCLA's campus with apparent impunity, and where police did not intervene to protect students, but rather stepped in only to evict and arrest student protesters standing in solidarity with Palestine. I am compelled to recognize the privilege I'm afforded here at UC Santa Barbara to be able to safely carry out my research, teaching, and work with our students, and the responsibility incumbent on me to recognize that while our university carries on with business as usual, Israel has reduced all of Gaza's 11 universities to rubble. Thousands of students and teachers have been killed. Hundreds of schools, including those run by the United Nations, have been bombed in what we must name as scholasticide and epistemicide. Our esteemed colleague, Shireen Seikali, has helped me to see that Palestine and Iraq are not merely laboratories for war games, colonial extraction, and public relations, nor are they repositories for our pity, but they are places of abundance. Indeed, as Shireen reminds us, Palestine is a paradigm that offers us an abundance of lessons about how to persist and insist on living in a world where none of us are sure what the future holds. The systematic erasure of individuals and institutions who carry forward the pursuits of learning and knowledge production, which we are all so deeply invested in, is devastating and terrifying. Yet we, the living within living institutions, carry forward in these pursuits, and within the humanities, we do so by centering human experience in our efforts to understand the present within ongoing histories of catastrophe. Thank you.
All right, and now to our third faculty fellow of the 2023-24 academic year, Rachael Scarborough-King, who is an associate professor in the English department. She researches and teaches the literature and media of the long 18th century, with particular emphasis on the digital humanities, newspapers and periodicals, and the history of the book. She's the author of Writing to the World, Letters and the Origins of Modern Print Genres, the editor of After Print, 18th Century Manuscript Cultures, and the co-editor of The Ends of Knowledge, Outcomes and Endpoints Across the Arts and Sciences. She is also the project director and principal investigator for the Ballator Project, a project combining archival research and computational analysis. Rachael will be discussing her current project, Improving Literature, Media, Environments, and the 18th Century Improvement Debate. Welcome, Rachael.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you both for those beautiful presentations. And of course, I want to follow you in thanking the IHC, just both for putting on this event and also for the fellowship, which has been really beneficial for me this year. So this talk is drawn from my in-progress book project, which explores the concept of improvement in the long 18th century. Improvement was one of the key words of the period, a newly dominant way to understand the shape of historical change, and the term that people at the time used to explain what they thought was characteristic of their society, rather than the post facto designation of enlightenment. In the 17th and 18th centuries, improvement shifted from having a primarily agricultural meaning, referring to the renovation of land and estates, to its now more common sense of general betterment, a betterment that is often directed at the individual rather than the collective. Focusing on what I call the book history of improvement, I argue that this process of semantic shift occurred in part through textual formats that materialized improvement in the object of the book. The 18th century pioneered new printed forms such as pre-ruled pocket diaries and before and after illustrations that enacted improvement by calling on the reader to interact with the book through additional writing, coloring, or manipulation. But while the concept of improvement can seem innocuous, it was used to justify colonial expansion, opposition to the abolitionist movement, and the enclosure of commons, which consolidated private property rights. And when I saw this quote, I was just like, thank you so much. This is exactly what I'm trying to say, right? The opposite of improvement is not decline, dissolution, it's revolution, right? And that's this process that's occurring in the 18th century. I explore these topics, that is colonial expansion, anti-abolitionism, the enclosure of commons, in earlier chapters of the book. In this talk, I'll look at how improvement figured in the ongoing 18th century debate over women's education and how women both internalized and resisted its logic in their everyday writings. In the 1970s and 80s, feminist scholars coined the term conduct literature to refer to a range of texts whose purpose was to set standards for female and occasionally male conduct. These books combined practical advice with general guidelines for women's social behavior, demeanor, and emotional responses. And these are just a few examples. Although the roots of conduct literature can be seen in the medieval period, the genre both transformed and multiplied in the 18th century, when practical how-to guides merged with advice on manners and personal improvement. Conduct books offered anodyne, stereotypical views of female behavior, generally aiming at adolescent girls who, from the text perspective, would soon become wives and mothers. But despite extensive cataloging of the genre, scholars continue to disagree on the extent to which women actually followed the prescriptive advice offered in conduct literature. Were these hyperbolic descriptions of idealized femininity or actual expectations for everyday behavior? It's difficult to know how real women would interpret such guidelines. Given that in conduct literature, women received advice about their behavior in written form, the act of reading occupied a crucial feedback loop between generalized guidance on conduct and individual self-improvement. Reading was the source of improvement both in content and in process. As Hester Chapone wrote in her influential letters on the improvement of the mind, which is the middle text there, with regard to accomplishments, the chief of these is a competent share of reading, well chosen and properly regulated. Conduct books drew on the older agricultural meaning of improvement to explain the trajectory of female development, with metaphors of cultivation, enclosure, and transplantation repeated across the texts. For example, in the conduct book Mentoria, Anne Murray wrote of her female pupils, quote, "I hope the soil of your understanding is so fertile and the cultures so well attended to, the buds of knowledge will expand before the usual time and be prematurely ripe. Continuing, I cannot doubt the advance of your improvement." In the process of recommending reading as the most appropriate means for improvement to take place, a process that is of cultivation and growth, these works participated in improvement's continuing shift from an agricultural to an individual emphasis. So in this talk, I'll look at the apparently non-literary genre of women's pocket diaries or pocketbooks for some insight into how everyday people interpreted conduct literature, and more broadly, into how they incorporated the concept of improvement into their lives. In the mid-18th century, a number of commercial book products developed to allow both women and men to follow conduct literature's advice to record their daily activities, expenses, and habits in order to keep an account of self-improvement. These books adapted the format of merchants' account books, and in doing so, they exemplified improvement's shift from a financial to an individual meaning. Pocket diaries, which first appeared in the 1740s, featured printed front matter that included literary material, history, biography, anecdotes, and excerpts from conduct literature, followed by or interspersed with printed charts from monthly memoranda and or accounts. And here we have both memorandums and then accounts on the right. Readers were supposed to enter debits and credits as well as appointments made and kept. Pocket diaries also typically included informational back matter, such as postal rates, mileage conversion tables, fiscal exchange rates, and wages for domestic workers, along with riddles, anagrams, and reader-supplied answers. They were typically bound in cheap leather covers that included a folded pocket for storing materials such as notes, newspaper clippings, or even small objects, blurring the boundaries between media and between definitions of the book. Adam Smith, for example, asks, and this is a scholar, not the Adam Smith, but anyway, quote, are these still books or have they become some other object, a depository, a cabinet, a little room? And can we still talk about readers or some other term is some other term necessary to accommodate the processes in play? These diaries assumed a reader who wanted to become a writer as well as a curator and archivist. I argue that women's use of pocket diaries offered particularly revealing examples of how they responded to cultural guidelines under the rubric of self-improvement. Women often misused pocket diaries from the start, as they purchased general diaries that assumed a male user or a gentleman's account book. Even in pocket diaries marketed to women, users often found a remarkable number of ways to customize the blank spaces headed memorandums and accounts. Diaries were sites where women simultaneously followed improving advice, a frequent piece of which was to keep a diary, and subverted it by turning the diaries to their own purposes. Women found ways to use the pocket diary to resist restrictive versions of improvement, But these ad hoc methods could not add up to a systematic response to their restrained social roles. Moreover, the material artifact of the pocket diary often reveals how improvement is not a sustainable metric, because one cannot always continue improving. Either the diary goes on for years, restarting every January and marking a monotonous sequence of false starts and backslidings, or it is abandoned. Women's pocket diaries at once enact and embody the cyclical rather than straightforward path of improvement. In the printed matter and in their form, pocket diaries seem to prescribe behavior, putting them, as Jenny Batchelor writes, quote, in the same ideological continuum as the 18th-century conduct book. With their emphasis on keeping an economic and social account of the self, pocket diaries presented, quote, essentially conservative social and domestic values. At the same time, however, the provision of blank space presumes customization, which users pursued in a variety of idiosyncratic ways. Michel Desserteau has emphasized how readers are rarely passive in their consumption of printed media, arguing that the reader, quote, invents in text something different from what they intended. He combines their fragments and creates something unknown in the space organized by their capacity for allowing an indefinite plurality of meanings. We could say that pocket diaries literalized Desserteau's observations by providing the space for readers to customize these printed products for their own use. Based on my reading of dozens of pocket diaries in archives, I would argue that almost all owners of pocket diaries did not follow directions for their use to the letter, but instead improvised their own accounting systems. So as I mentioned, many users of pocket diaries subverted their ostensible purpose simply by purchasing the wrong title. So for example, in 1753, a woman who was likely Frances Hanbury Williams, although the volume has no inscription, used the Daily Journal for the year of our Lord 1753, or the Gentleman's and Tradesman's Regular Account Book for the pocket, to record her social activities in London and the country. The printed title page of the book, now held in the Hertfordshire Archives, describes it as, quote, in a form entirely new and the order of time through the year so contrived as to answer every man's purpose. But Hanbury Williams, who was the daughter of prominent diplomat Charles Hanbury Williams, and future wife of William Hollis Capel, Lord Essex, apparently found this pocket diary to answer her purpose of recording her lessons, reading, activities, visits, and entertainment. Instead of following the page's format of entering an account of money on the verso or left-hand side of each opening and appointments and memorandums or observations on the recto or right-hand side, she used the verso for morning activities marked M and recto for evening marked E. To see a full day, one has to read across the gutter from left to right. Hanbury Williams filled up the accounts column with her morning activities, but left the columns for tallies of pounds, shilling, and pence received and paid entirely blank. So that continues throughout the book. She never fills in that column. Likewise, she filled the appointments column with her evening activities, but only occasionally added events into the memorandums or observations column. She diligently followed this system from January 1st until September 22nd, 1753, when the entries abruptly end with the remaining pages left blank. And I haven't been able to figure out any biographical reason why she suddenly left the diary off in September. Maybe she just lost it, who knows? But they just stop. Despite her idiosyncratic use of this gentleman's and tradesman's account book, Hanbury Williams's entries show her in many ways behaving like the model young woman of conduct literature. At the time of writing, she would have been about 18. She would marry Capel the following year and die in childbirth in 1759, and these are her two surviving children. In this way, the account book offers insight into a period of life when she was not primarily defined by her father, husband, or children. In this year, the year of the account book, 1753, Charles Hanbury Williams, her father, was in St. Petersburg as the British envoy to the Russian court, and his daughter was staying with family in London. In the mornings, Frances read, attended painting lessons, practiced music, saw friends and family, dressed, dined, and engaged in some incipient domestic economy, such as settling my accounts. In the evenings, in addition to her habitual reading, she engaged in a wide variety of social activities. When in London, she attended concerts where she usually sang, saw a wide circle of acquaintances, went to assemblies, went to the opera, and on one occasion attended a masquerade ball. Twice she went with friends to see Dr. Stevens's telescope. The first time they were disappointed, but on the second she saw the moon, Venus, and Jupiter, as she notes in her account book. During the particularly busy week of March 5th, she attended assemblies on Monday, Thursday, and Saturday, as well as a concert on Wednesday, which sounds exhausting, but this is all recorded in the book. When in the country during the summer, her activities were more domestic, but she still took a trip to the resort town of Tunbridge Wells, where she, quote, went to the walks and to shops. Although the diary features little introspection on her activities, as it only has those small spaces for each day, it shows that she considered it valuable to keep this record of what she was doing. Another young woman's pocket diary offers more personal accounting, but also manipulates the printed spaces of the book for individual purposes. Mary Howard, the daughter of Quaker chemist and meteorologist Luke Howard, known today as the namer of clouds, he came up with the terminology we use for clouds, was 15 or 16 during the year covered by her diary, a copy of the miner's pocket diary for the youth of both sexes. So she's choosing an appropriate title for her age, but still uses it in her own ways. The printed matter in this diary is minimal, so there's not a lot of front and back matter, with no prefatory material offering instructions on its use, which is somewhat surprising given that it is for the youth. However, Howard devised her own system for its use, with a code that she elaborated at both the front and back of the volume. The manuscript portion, and I know this is very hard to read, it was very hard for me to read in the archive as well, but just to have a sense of what it looks like. So the manuscript portion of the book opens with a blank page headed Memorandums, which Howard used to list her lessons and reading material. She then used the first of her weekly tables to set out a code she would deploy when recording her activities in her diary, marking employments and exercise with a heading of A, which is then subdivided into Roman numerals and Arabic numbers, and amusements with B, which is similarly subdivided. Some of these activities she sets out should be done daily, some weekly, and some monthly or, quote, if convenient. Howard's lessons, which she details here, consisted of English grammar, exercise, reading, spelling, parsing, questions on grammar, French, writing exercise, learning exercise, grammar, verbs, reading, geography, coloring maps, vocabulary, questions on geography, writing copies and rules, ciphering, tables, reading, and catechism work. And she lists all of these that she's supposed to do on a certain schedule. She's creating this all for herself. So she reiterated a weekly cycle of repeating these activities using the left-hand memorandums page for her daily entries and the right-hand accounts page for additional notes and occasional expenses. However, Howard seemed to have struggled to keep up with her ambitious schedule. Although she was diligent the first month of the year, in February her family moved from Plaistow to Tottenham, both now neighborhoods of London. Howard's entry for February 4th reads, "Today we left our native place." And on February 15th, she noted, "Since the 29th of the first month, I have been principally employed in unpacking, etc." In March, she recommitted herself to her diary, writing, "I have been rather interrupted since the beginning of the week, but today, I think it was, I made the following resolution: to go to bed before supper and to rise in time for lessons and to get ready in time for lessons, and not to tire myself out with one thing but be regular." And also the "I think it was" shows that she's coming back to fill in her diary later, right? So she'll sort of try to catch up, but then she fails to do it. On June 27th, she recorded her hope that her diary would, quote, "be much more correct than it has been for 22 weeks. But on July 11th, she wrote, "My hopes set down at the end of last month have been disappointed, and I may say the same as I did then as to exceptions," and that means exceptions to her schedule. While the volume of her writing ebbed and flowed through the year in this way, she concluded her final entry on December 26th by noting, "This week and last, I think I have done in general nearly according to the plan." Despite her continual admonishments to herself to improve in both diary keeping and in the early to bed, early to rise habits she planned to record in her diary, she apparently saved her diary after the end of the year, or perhaps it was kept as a memento, as Howard, like Cable, does not appear to have survived to adulthood. Indeed, archival examples show how the keepers of pocket diaries often preserve their books for years, despite the apparently ephemeral nature of such texts. In this way, they followed the frequent prefatory dictum that the quotes, quote, "if preserved, will enable any lady to tell what business she has transacted," and what visits she has received or paid every day during any period of her life, as the Lady's Complete Pocketbook for 1753 advertised. In such self-referential marketing copy, pocket diaries linked material and personal improvement, with titles such as Reese's Improved Pocket Diary and The New Memorandum Book Improved. The author of the latter book promised that his title, quote, should yearly receive every possible improvement which might contribute to render it either more useful or entertaining, arguing that it was, quote, not only improved, but rendered greatly preferable to any of those who have pretended to imitate it. Pocket diaries encouraged their users to record their self-improvement while also arguing that the books themselves improved as material objects. The physical improvement of the book was explicitly tied to the personal and social improvement of its owner. The unmarried female owners of pocket diaries, the category of people to whom 18th century conduct literature was primarily directed, turned their diaries to a variety of purposes, even as they, at a broad level, followed improving advice to digest their activities in reading and written form, and to preserve their diaries as a retrospective record. It's clear that they did not intend to respond directly to the instructions for women's improvement that were prominent in conduct literature and in the diary's front matter. But by adapting these genres for their own purposes, they showed both how improvement could or could not happen on an individual basis, and how women could resist the cultural codes assigned to them. By inviting the addition of handwriting, pocket diaries also invited a form of personalization that could contradict their own ostensible purpose. So I want to conclude by noting the long tail of this version of commodified self-improvement, especially for women. The pocket diary offers an origin for today's wellness journal, which similarly offers customizable writing space that is meant to adhere to a particular form. These products have completed improvement's transition from a public to private meaning, as the improvement sought is entirely directed inward. And I want to emphasize that this is my own journal, so as much as I'm very skeptical of this, I engage in it myself. Not filled in, as you can see. With the prevalence of such genres and ongoing campaigns around wellness and self-care, it's significant to remember the often coercive uses of self-improvement in the 18th century and its origins in agricultural and financial contexts. If the opposite of improvement is revolution, then such individually oriented forums will not allow us to build the solidarity and communal care necessary in this moment.